live on the Digital Creators podcast, and we're here with Philip Gostelow. Welcome, Phil. Philip.
Welcome to you.
So, Philip is a portrait and documentary photographer and filmmaker. During a career in which he's been based in Tokyo, Shanghai, Sydney, and Perth, his portraiture features work that's been published in Time Magazine, Figaro, Wall Street Journal, The Independent, on Sunday Review, and VOGUE China. His Black Christmas Bushfires 2001 series is in the permanent collections of the National Gallery of Australia and Museum of Australia. He's directed a number of short films, including Max Pam, The Freddie Incident, which was shortlisted for the WA Screen Culture Awards 2023, Down the Wrong Path, and Lunch. He graduated in architecture from Curtin University. I want to start off with your, how you got into photography. Or architecture, or the creative.
Well, look, I graduated in architecture. I was 23. I really had no interest in photography at all at that point. I got work after graduating, and my aim was really just to get enough money as a draftsperson to travel. And a mate and I went overland, basically, well, as much as we could, in the mid-'80s. Ended up in London. And it was when I was traveling through Europe and the Middle East that I got a inclination that, hey, I was quite fascinated by photography, just because I was traveling and coming across these, amazing cultural experiences. And my girlfriend at the time was pretty keen on photography, and I was learning a bit from her. We went through a pretty cool backpacker trip by ourselves from Istanbul to the south of the Nile. That's what really spun my wheel, because meeting these interesting people, fascinating cultures, and I really kind of took a next level jump with my photography. And I was starting to use color transparency film, as opposed to what I've been using before was like color negative, and just having it developed at the canvas. So I moved to, as an architect, I moved to Canada. And I decided, well, look, I've got to, if I'm really going to try to be an architect, I want to work with someone who's really good rather than just going for money, which I had been in London. So I worked with this really great guy in Toronto. He'd won like the Royal Canadian Institute of Architects residential award the year before. So he was top notch. But so I worked with him, but in doing that, I realized that I wasn't really cut out. I didn't have the same amount of ego invested in kind of controlling the clients to, have a design this way or that way.
So you didn't want to take the route just going for money like you did in London.
Yeah.
But then when you found out going for someone who was really great as well, you didn't like directing the clients too much.
Yeah, I just felt it was a bit like bullying, and it was a small practice. It was like only four of us really. And it was a great experience for me, but I just realised, even though I've kind of wanted to be an architect since the age of 10, maybe something's wrong here. But meanwhile, with the photography, I was more or less self-taught, but I'd do some night classes, and I was renting darkroom space. I just, in the year of, like, the late 80s in Toronto, I just got more and more involved. I couldn't help myself. Because the real difference for me was architecture. A lot of the things you're working on in a team, or the projects take so long to complete, or sometimes they don't go ahead. You might have spent 18 months on them and nothing's happened. For one reason or another, the client has a change of heart, or they can't, with the bylaws and regulations, they can't do what they want. Whereas photography was entirely spontaneous, So you could, take some street photos and you could develop it that same day, and you've got the results. So that's what really spun my wheel. The fact that I could use my skill having learnt from architecture, like, compositionally and what have you. But it was another way of connecting with people too, really, photographing them and immersing yourself or being a fly on the wall.
So you were sort of looking for that in architecture, but you found it in photography, the connecting with people and creating.
Yeah, I felt the architecture thing was just, you're kind of removed a bit from reality because you're doing all these designs and what have you, but
it takes so long to see it.
Yeah, and as I was saying, a lot of the projects you worked on never manifested, or you'd be, project managing, not designing, or you'd be designing, like, whatever. I'm just using it as a metaphor. It's like, the toilet blocks of a bigger project. Say, well, yeah. So I kind of bailed. And then I decided, another friend of mine, we got a combi van and we zigzagged through the US for about 9 months in a combi van. And I just photographed. And from that point onwards, I knew that I can't go back. Architecture was a nice foundation, but it wasn't for me.
How old were you when you did that trip?
About 28. And so from there, I stayed in Canada for a bit, but my visa was, I couldn't get a renewal. And a friend of mine, who was Japanese architect, he said, look, if I had to go back to Australia, basically, or I had to leave Canada because I'd been there for 3 years and I couldn't renew my visa. Cut a long story short, my friend said I could stay with if I was doing a stopover in Tokyo, I could stay with his father who lived outside Tokyo. And as chance would have it, I took him up on that offer, and then I had one connection from Canada who was this person who was an illustrator and living in Tokyo, quite experienced illustrator. And I'd only been in Tokyo a few days, and I met up with her and her husband. I took my portfolio, and she said, hey, look, you should look at these. I know the guy who runs his magazine. I'll give you his number. Go see him. And within a week of me being in Tokyo, with my little flimsy portfolio, I got work, and I never looked back. It was just one of those, occasional synchronicities of good fortune. And then from then, I spent 5 years in Tokyo, working with a bunch of magazines, mostly Japanese ones, which I got to know on a personal level, the editors and what have you. And then also international, some publications from Australia, some from England.
But that was through Japan?
That was when I was in Tokyo.
So were you working full-time for a magazine company, or you were
freelance? No, I was always freelance. I didn't have the mentality to kind of be a staff photographer. I always wanted to be, I valued my freedom too much, particularly from having wanderlust and travel. So photography kind of gave me, in essence, it gave me the freedom to travel and make money from it, because I could do, photo stories and either on commission to magazines, or I could sell them afterwards. That, and when I was in Tokyo, I was doing, earning my money mostly doing portraits for magazines.
So yeah, I saw some portraits on your website of some big sort of names in the US.
Yeah, well, so what would happen is, I was gung-ho at that. I was more ignorant than anything, but I had no one to tell me to stop. So I just, constantly upgrading my portfolio. Whenever I got what I thought was a good portrait of something, I'd print it out and put it in my portfolio and replace it with something, replace something else I'd had. And I'd always, in that time when I was in Canada, being an architect during the day, and at night time I'd be either looking through photo books or in the darkroom, and I kind of learnt a few photographers. I really liked their style. So I didn't know a lot when I started, like I was professional, but
which photographers did you like?
Ones that come to mind were obviously like Cartier-Bresson, because he did portraits as well as photo reportage. But I loved his the way his compositional ability of live action scenarios, you know, just like the way he caught the moment. He was the one that coined the phrase of capturing the moment, decisive moment, yeah. And some other of the older photographers from that vintage. There's a younger guy, Dutch, Anton Corbijn, I think is pronounced. He was doing a lot of music portraits and photography for music CDs and what have you. He worked a lot with U2,
yep.
I think Nick Cave even, back in the 80s and 90s. And I loved he was what I was really drawn to him because he also used the square format.
Yep.
So I loved the Hasselblad, which is 6.6.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So most of my portraits were shot with a Hasselblad, which I'd bought secondhand before leaving Canada,
yep.
from a wedding photographer. And so, hang on, I'm getting a bit off track, I'm not sure. So,
but no, and because in Japan you were shooting all on film, right?
Yes, it was all on film. So what happened is so I'd upgrade my portfolio constantly, and I'd be knocking on the door of this magazine or that magazine who I knew did these profiles on visiting they were celebrities, but they were PRing their film, or then they were on a rock band tour or had a new CD, So after not so long, I guess what they saw in me was, apart from being keen, I was a foreigner, and they could see that I could talk and put these visiting celebrities, whatever, at ease.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Whereas the Japanese photographers were
like a different
usually shy and not knowing really how to. So that you could see it in their imagery too. You could sense there wasn't a real trust.
Yeah.
And they were too hesitant. So I had that. It was just like right time, right place. There's a bit of timing. And as a foreigner, I barely spoke Japanese at that point, but it wasn't. They didn't mind. All they were worried, all they were concerned about, was that if I could relate to these visiting American or English, subjects, and they seemed to like my work, so I just kept getting that opportunity.
And what was it like meeting and working with Quentin Tarantino?
Well, he was admittedly, it was earlier in his career, but I think that was his first trip to Japan, and subsequent to that, he got, like you've seen Kill Bill and what have you, he had a thing for Japan. He's fascinated by it. And I remember photographing him, or what would normally happen is I'd sit in on the interview, so they have the journalist doing the interview, and I just get a bit of a sense of like he's comfortable in his the same room as him, so he knows, for instance, like Tarantino, So I'd sit in on the interview, so I got a bit of a sense of what the story was about and who the person, it was Tarantino, whoever. And then we'd do the photo shoot afterwards, and it'd normally only have about 20 minutes. Sometimes you could push it a bit longer, but and that the shoot would ordinarily also be in the same room because they'd allocated one room for the PR interviews and stuff. So I'd have to find like a blank wall, or if I couldn't find that, some interesting backdrop that I could use. Because sometimes I'd bring in my own backdrop. But in Tokyo, the taxi drivers wouldn't stop for you if you like a flag in a taxi and they saw you with a big scroll, they wouldn't wouldn't stop. So sometimes I'd actually have to do it by a subway,
Yeah.
But in the case of Tarantino, it was just there was luckily a white wall, and so I just I was talking to him. He was quite easy to get along with, actually. I'm sure it may be a different situation if you photographed him now, but. We had, because there's all, like with portraiture, it's all about just building up that little bit of a rapport initially, and so they're at ease, or you get more at ease, and if you're at ease, it reflects on them, So it was just a matter of kind of having a sense of who I am and make them at ease,
And what like.
And then just not let on that I didn't know what the fuck I was doing,
And what did you want to capture about him? Like, what was kind of unique about his personality that you sort of captured?
I noticed he had big hands, strangely, and he had kind of, a long chin. And I hadn't seen, because often when you go to do these portraits, you'd also get tickets to go see the preview of the film. So I did a lot of that. So in fact, I didn't see Reservoir Dogs until after I'd seen him, but I'd been told that he was also acting in the movie, right?
Oh, that's what he was...
So he was promoting, he was doing pre-production on what was Pulp Fiction, but he was there in Japan promoting Reservoir Dogs. So, but he was cool. Like, he introduced himself as, hi, I'm Quentin, and we had a nice rapport talking about, because I just lived in Toronto, and he'd just been to the Toronto Film Festival, the big festival in Canada, and he was explaining the importance of it and stuff, So we got on fine. And normally when I'm doing the portraits, and particularly because I was using film, I'd normally take like 1 or 2 Polaroids initially just to make sure the exposure was correct, and then you'd only the film back of like the film canister, if you like, for the Hasselblad, it only held 12 frames, so you'd wind that on, and when it was finished, you'd have to replace it. So that gave me a bit of time to talk as well with the subject.
So was that on medium format? Were the Quentin photos on?
Yeah. So they're all Hasselblad, yeah. And so, I mean, that was just one example.
With the flash?
Yeah, we have an off-camera flash. So I'd have a little small flash gun on a tripod with an umbrella, either I think it was a reflector, the one I used for him. And cool. You just position it in such a way that you knew where the shadow was going to be cast on his face.
And how many years were you in Japan working there?
So I spent a total of 5 years there. So, apart from doing those portraits, and it wasn't all about getting huge salaries, huge fees. It was like, I remember those ones it was Figaro Japan, which is the French magazine, Figaro, but they had a Japanese version of it. You'd get paid about 30,000 yen, which was, I don't know, it was probably like 300 US less. But I just did it because, with every one, I'd like to think I got a little more comfortable doing it and get better and better. And, some of the opportunities with some of the, celebrities, it was always good for your portfolio.
Yeah. And what was it like living in those 5 years in Japan? As like a summary, was it like just like a lot of fun, or was it what were the highlights and the?
No, look, it was a crazy place. It was fun. It was
because in the 90s, that's kind of an iconic.
Yeah. It was. Well, I got there in '91, and it was already the boom economy was already on the tail end. So I didn't know what it was like during the '80s when it was just like apparently crazy money everywhere, and the fees and whatever you could charge were just astronomical. But yeah, so I was there from like 91 to 96, and I wasn't living an expat life. I was just renting in a little Japanese apartment like most other foreigners I knew were. But there was a great creative energy there, just because, for one thing, like the magazines, the way the Japanese saw visual artistry was different to the mentality of the West. And even I still love some of their magazines because they'd start from like reverse of ours. So like, we have a magazine, we open it from the front. They would reverse it, so you'd open it from the back and move that way. Yeah. But the layouts, the graphic design was really super cool. And my lifestyle there was pretty. I mean, the first year I went crazy. I guess I needed to get some stuff out of my system. But then one of my trips I'd taken was to Mongolia. Just not long after Mongolia had broken out of what was the Russian communism, as it were. I forget why, but I think it was just the remoteness, and I'd always had this fascination about, if not Siberia, Mongolia. So I'd had this, I'm just going to go to Mongolia. So I'd saved up enough money from my magazine jobs. I got some commissions to do some smaller features, which would be enough to cover my trip. So I went to, I was there for like more than a month, but when I came back, I got some great material, but unfortunately, what I didn't realize is when I was heading back, I went back to Beijing, and then from Beijing flew to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong to Tokyo. But I remember in Beijing, I'd wake up in the morning and I would be just like craving ice cream and Coca-Cola. So I'd literally go to like the nearest shop where I could find Coca-Cola and ice cream, and I'd just devour it. And it wasn't until I got back to Tokyo I started turning yellow, and I realized, oh, what's going on here? And I was
your liver or something.
I was totally fatigued, and I went to the doctor, and I guess he picked it up immediately. He said, hey, we have to book a hospital for you, because I had hepatitis.
Oh.
I'd got it somewhere in Mongolia, presumably.
Oh, okay.
So I had all this great material, but I couldn't do anything with it for another 6 months until I kind of recovered, and it got into some good magazines the following year.
Yeah, because I saw those portraits you showed me on your website. So can you tell me about those Mongolian portrait series?
Well, some of it was actually because Mongolia at the time, there's barely any infrastructure functionally, because it had, during the communist years, all the nomads had been kind of organised into cooperatives. So the nomads would have herds of sheep or goats or camels, some. But seasonally they'd move around, but they would also have like the cooperatives where they could sell their stock, or if it was wool or if it was meat or whatever. There was a system where they would get money. But in the free market, as it was, when it had just become, it was all up shit creek, basically. So a lot of people were moving to Ulaanbaatar, the main city, and there was a lot of these, like on the outside of the city, there's all these nomads who had pitched their tents and just had these plots of land. So it was, and they'd been buying their gasoline on credit from Russia, because they didn't have enough money to pay for it. So the whole country was up, it was barely functional. So in terms of, luckily I had from a French photographer, before I left Tokyo, he'd just been there on a fashion shoot. Just by coincidence, I caught up with him. He gave me the contact of his fixer. So when I arrived in Ulaanbaatar, I luckily was met by his fixer, who was this, she was like late 20s, lovely Mongolian lady. She had a young daughter. And I stayed with her family for the first week. And then they organised accommodation for me at the local university, because it was summer break, so the students weren't at university. I could rent one of their dorm rooms. But it was all, and when I would kind of organise, okay, I want to try and get photos of this scenario, that, or whatever, can we go out and get some nomads, or the coal mining or something. And they, through friends of friends of friends, they would organise like someone who had a car, because there was no taxis barely. There were a few, but if you wanted to go off on your own particular route, you'd have to hire someone with a private car, basically. So yeah, that was an amazing experience. And I got some, going back to the photos you saw, they were mostly of the family that I stayed with. And because over the period of time that I was there, the month or so, I'd go and have meals with them or what have you, and I photographed most of the family members. But they were all living in these kind of gulagish Russian communistic fascist apartment blocks, So, but just, even though I obviously couldn't speak the language, just to be amongst them and be accepted was quite remarkable, because whenever I'd leave that family unit, and you're walking out in the main square where I had to walk back to go to my accommodation at the university, it was always threats of someone wanting to pick a fight with you, just because they assumed I was Russian because I was white, and they hated Russians. So there's a lot of alcoholism happening as a result of the downturn of the economy. So almost every day I was in Ulaanbaatar, I had to avoid getting smacked in the face. It was quite oppressive. But regardless of that, it was just an amazing experience.
So most of the portraits of people who you stayed with or strangers?
Yep. Or the people I stayed with. And then when I'd organise these bivouacs with my fixer, Dugima, you know, I'd say, look, I want to, if we're driving by and I saw someone walking by the highway, or you know, looked like they're walking to work or from work, I'd stop and I'd say, look, can we find out what this person's doing? And I'd organise just off the cuff portrait.
Yep.
And we took a couple of bigger trips out west across the steep to, you know, stay overnight with Mongol nomads and what have you. And that was, again, I just, you know, find out, asking lots of questions and trying to get portraits or photographs of just day-to-day stuff they were doing, you know.
And after Japan, you went to China?
So, yeah, after Japan, moved to Sydney. Just because I figured that was the best place for work in terms of, you know, what I was doing with magazines.
Is that because Japan was going?
No, the main reason I'd kind of had enough, because as much as Japan was fascinating, it was just finding it too stressful, particularly with the cultural differences, and they were very inexpressive, you know, and they're too polite. So they, you know, I had a bunch of, I wasn't lacking friends. It was just simply that dealing on a day-to-day basis with the Japanese, and I could speak some Japanese by then, but you know, I was just finding it too awkward and frustrating. It was kind of like, you know, you never really felt like you knew what they really thought about you, or if you're trying to just have a general discussion about, and it could be politics or anything, you know, sport, you wouldn't feel like you're getting what they really felt, because it was impolite for them to say. So that was getting on my nerves, and my partner and I, she was having our first child, so that was like an excuse to say, okay, I got to get out of here, you know. So that was the catalyst, if you like.
Okay.
So I moved to Sydney, and as easy it was, or as like the luck I had by moving to Tokyo and getting work, it was the exact opposite in Sydney. So even though I had what I thought was a pretty good portfolio, you know, Sydney was already saturated with editorial photographers, people doing portraits and photo stories. So I kind of had to start from the ground up, and just kind of, you know,
work your way up again.
Yeah, I did. And by that time I was starting to get more interested in not kind of flimsy editorial photo stories, but ones with a bit more substance. So I started getting more involved with, I still love doing the portraits, but again, I didn't have as much chance there in Sydney to do like celebrity portraits, but I was still doing portraits as a bread and butter with magazines, and then I got more involved in more interesting social documentary, I suppose. And I did some work with Australian Geographic magazine, but that was entirely fulfilling in certain ways, because it was a bit like they've already kind of preconceived what they're going to write about beforehand, in a certain way.
So they tell you to shoot something in a certain way?
Not stylistically, but just, you know, we've got to cover, like, you know, we get, you know, whatever, it could be, you know, farmers, vineyards, or photograph the harvest, or, you know, we want to see, get some outback pubs and the people working the pubs. I mean, it was all good and fun, but I just found it a bit, you know, there's a certain contrivedness to it, you know, I suppose. Not to criticise Australian Geographic, it's just simply that it was, you know, our idea of what the outback is, for instance, you know. It's a kind of cliche to a degree.
Oh, okay.
So what I started doing was, I'd always had a love of India, and I'd been there a few times photographing myself, and I got this idea to do a couple of photo stories in India. So I went back there a couple of times to do those.
Personal stuff or
Uh,
commission?
it was ideas I had for stories, which I with some of my contacts from Japan or Hong Kong or Sydney, I had a gauge of like I could, you know, there's some interest in this. So
You would sort of contact the magazines or people at the magazines
before
and
yeah,
pitch the idea, and see if
exactly.
you can get like funding.
Not just
funding, but
interest, just interest. And see, when I was in Japan, I could sometimes get a Japanese magazine to like give me a whole bunch of film to before I left to go toward the like you do the story for us. So it wasn't like a direct contract or anything written in stone, but they would help you.
But you would still pay for the flights.
Yeah, I would still, yeah. But then it was better in a way because you would have the freedom. You wouldn't have to be locked into like doing a commission specifically on this. So if I went by myself, I could, I had more time and I would stay longer, and I'd normally do a few stories to satisfy, like to cover my expenses and make some money. So because I had some.
So would you sell these stories to the magazine, or they
Yeah, so I had some, still had some good contacts in Tokyo, and in Hong Kong I had some contacts of airline magazines, which in those days they were far more pictorial, and you could do like a photo feature for them about one of their destinations where they fly to, but it wasn't so much a destination piece, the kind of vapid. It was like I would normally pitch like cultural stories. So you get to know a different aspect of, you know, it didn't matter if it was India or Vietnam, China or something, you know, so you have some sort of substance. So, and then I would try and do a bit more of a gritty story, perhaps, which I could try to sell to a publication that was more...
So by trying to, because I'm not too sure how documentary photography works, but if you have an idea for a story, I guess you pitch it, or maybe you've already shot something and say, hey, if you want to use my photos, you sell the photos, or?
You'd give them, well, because see, this is all before internet, so it was like you'd be faxing, sending faxes overseas, or if you're for like black and white stuff, you'd have to print your images and send them like express post or whatever, registered mail, to London or Tokyo or something after the fact.
And
so
hope your check comes back in the mail.
Well, you just hope the postie delivered it, you know, got the right address. So yeah, I would perhaps like, for instance, there was a story I loved doing from late 90s was of this slum in Delhi, which was made up of generational street performers. So they were mostly illiterate. They'd learnt their craft from their parents, who in turn learnt their craft from their parents. And they were mostly from Rajasthan. So they were kind of like gypsies, but the original gypsies, which were actually Rajasthani. So, and some of them were acrobats, some of them were puppeteers, some were musicians, magicians. And so I found, I'd seen this, I learned about the story, and I figured, okay, this is fascinating. And I found out from my connections with other magazines, like Time magazine, there used to be a guy who was Deepak Puri, who was like the coordinator of South Asia. And you'd go and see him, and he'd help fix your story, like, you know, where you had to go, and he'd organise someone to get you there, a fixer or whatever. So through his help, I found out where this slum was. I went there over a period of about 10 days. I got some connections there in the slum, and I photographed these families who had, you know, like I was saying, different artistries. And I felt like I had a good amount of work, but it wasn't enough to finish the story. So the next year I arranged, and I went back, and I was there for like, I think I was in India like a month of that occasion, but I only spent like about 10 days in Delhi with the slum people. These amazing artists.
Were they in a circus or?
No, they're all individual. They usually work within a family, and they would have an agent, and the agent would book them for like a wedding, for instance, or a cultural event that might be happening in Delhi, or certain Hindu festivals. They might have performers, or particularly at Hindu temples that might be more aligned with like Hanuman, the monkey god, and so you might have a guy who is like a Hanuman impersonator, Barupia, they're referred. He would get, he might get paid to perform at this temple for a couple of days or something over a particular festival. Yeah. And some of them actually had performed overseas. I mean, they were talented, and they'd had the opportunity through cultural exchange programs to perform in Europe or America. But regardless of that, they're all kind of living in this slum and not too much money. And but it was just a remarkable Zen view, if you like, of an aspect of culture that was in contemporary times, as it was still surviving, but barely. But once upon a time, these the Maharajas would have these performers.
Do you think they're still going?
The last time I was, every subsequent time I was in Delhi, I'd normally drop in because I had like one family. I particularly, the guy was really lovely, Puran Bhatt. So I'd normally drop in for a tea or whatever. And after I'd done the story, I think I tried to maybe post photos because that's what you had to do. And again, there was no internet. So, but I did make a point of giving them prints. And I think I had like a printout of the actual layout of the magazine feature. So it's just and I gave them some money too, because it was like I said, that these guys are, working, it's hard yards. And so if I'm taking photos and I'm making some money out of it, morally I felt, well, the least I can do is, give them some money for their time. And I gave them prints, so.
And what do you find interesting about India? Do you still like traveling there now?
Look, I haven't. The last time I took my son. Last time, it was probably about 8 years ago. But I'm itching to go back. I'd love to go back. But it just, it's kind of like therapy in a way, because every time you go, it's so much in your face, and everyone's wanting something from you. And
is it therapy because you're like
you're
like a celebrity?
Well, no, not that so much. It's just like it was more like the anger control, because you could get pissed. I mean, everyone's trying to rip you off. But as bad as any one day could be in India, there'd all be something remarkable happening that you just feel like, this is why I'm here. It's just wonderful, some beautiful experience. So. And plus it's easy to communicate because English is the unifying language, and it's just so many characters, and just I even appreciate some of the people that they try and rip you off. They're ripping you off, but they're doing it in such a great way, so subtle that you got to laugh. But yeah, it was always wonderful, and just so rich. It's so much happening at any one time. It didn't matter if you're in the cities or out in the country town. It's just beautiful, wonderful.
Do you prefer living in a chaotic place or quiet place?
Look, I've had both. Living in Tokyo and in Shanghai, which I moved to later.
They were chaotic?
No, Tokyo was very ordered, but it was very intense. And daytime population at the time was about 24 million. And Shanghai was about the same any time of day. But there's a beauty to those places because there's an order, and in India, in Mumbai or Delhi, which is also 20 odd million people. There's a beauty to them because there's a kind of a rhythm of life you get into and a flow. So even when I was living in Shanghai, I'd have my bicycle, and it's my chief form of transport when I didn't need to carry gear or get a long journey with a taxi. I'd just be cycling. But it all kind of worked, even as chaotic as it was. But I lived in the Blue Mountains. That was the most peaceful I've ever been, outside Sydney. I had a house there. So I really appreciated that. But I guess it depends at different times in life. You might need chaos. Other times you might need peace, you know. And now I'm a bit older, I prefer the peace. But even though I'm living in kind of central Perth, Northbridge, it's you know, I can step out onto William Street and I can get the craziness or the hustle bustle. But you know, here I can, you know, laneways and that, there's no noise at all. So.
And after India, did you go? Is that when you went to Shanghai?
Well, in India, I would go there on work trips. But so after Tokyo, I moved to Sydney, and I was in Sydney for about, I think, 7 years. Yeah. And I moved.
Is that because I don't want to skip steps, but is that when you shot the bushfires?
Yes,
Sydney?
The bushfires was in Sydney. Yeah.
Because that bushfire series you shot, that's part of the Australian National Gallery.
National Gallery. Yeah,
collection.
they purchased it afterwards. So, cut a long story short, what had happened was I was living, as I was saying, in the Blue Mountains. So this was like they had the Black Christmas Bushfires. It was actually the first flames were on Christmas of 2001. And it continued on and off for a few weeks, and there's it covered through like the southern extent of Sydney inland and the national parks, and it came up toward the Blue Mountains, and we were living there at the time, and it looked pretty grim, and it got to the point where we were asked to evacuate, and in the township we were living in, and so I was taking some photos in the lead up of these few days when it was really close, because I had a lot of nervous energy, and there was an adrenaline because you could smell the smoke, and you're getting updates constantly on the radio and what have you. And my neighbours were all, we had to block our gutters and fill them with water in case to put out ash in case the hot what do you call it? The embers would come with the wind and land on the roof, and if they weren't put out on the roof or on the gutter, they spread to the grass and what have you. So there's a lot of anxiety. Anyway, I only shot a few rolls of film, but it was enough to get a sense of what was happening, because it was more about the psychology of this behind the scenes of the fire. Because I'm not a conflict photographer. I don't want to get in the eye line of a sniper or a front end battle or whatever, or for that matter, even the front end of a bushfire with all the flames. But so I was kind of, unbeknownst to me, I was kind of just photographing the hidden anxiety and psychology of what was happening behind, with the people living in the township and the rural fire brigade people. And then just a week later, one of the magazines in Sydney contacted me to see if I would want to do this portrait series of people who'd lost their houses in the fires. So I went out and, with my Hasselblad again, with a journalist, we photographed like about 5 different families who'd lost their houses. So it was awkward to do, because obviously these people had lost, some were insured, some weren't, but it was the same way as with Quentin Tarantino. You just have to kind of break the ice and be calm and respectful. And so I did this series of portraits of the families who'd lost their houses, and I combined those with the shots I'd taken around my own township, and I had this photo series on what was the Black Christmas Bushfires. And so I was lucky enough to it was in a festival, and selected, shortlisted for a prize, and then subsequent to that, because the curator of photography at the National Gallery had seen it in this competition, the shortlisted exhibited, she wanted to add it to the collection. So it was, it was out of my hands. It was just like one of those things that just snowballed. So that was probably my nicest piece of work, if I look back on it photojournalistically from Sydney. Yeah, so, and then from Sydney, because I was a constant wanderlust and restlessness, I moved back to Perth for a couple of years, but I just found it too small, and I was still very much focused on editorial work. I hadn't worked out how to connect with corporate clients and stuff, and there was no agent here that I could call upon. So whilst I was in the 2 years in Perth, and I still had my young kids, their mother and I had separated by that point, so she'd moved over so we could all be together. We're all on good terms. There was no anxiety, no stress or animosity, but to trying to do the right thing by the kids. But after India, I'd kind of wanted to take a break from travelling there to do photo stories. I'd been back several times over the years and loved working there, but it's just I needed something different. So another photographer I knew was basing himself part-time in Shanghai. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll go to China. And so in 2005, I went to China a couple of times on like my own documentary scenarios. And the second time, I was lucky enough to get a commission before I left with it was a Film Review magazine. We wanted to do this feature in China.
Did you reach out to them, or?
Yeah, I told them I was going. So in those days, we had internet at that point. Yeah, so I'd let all my contacts know. Look, I'm going to go to whatever, Vanuatu. I'm going to go to Darwin. I'm going to go to Shanghai. If anything you need, I'll be there. Let me know. So I
What
went.
year is this?
This is 2005.
Okay, so yeah, emailing now, not faxing.
Yeah. We're actually sending little JPEGs and we're emailing. So it's like a jump ahead.
And
in
were
technology.
you shooting like when did you change from film to digital?
Yeah, good question. So I was still shooting my Hasselblad at this point. So I would shoot. I'd kind of given up. I'd still shooting some black and white, but I closed down my darkroom. I had my own darkroom in my kitchen. Or actually, when I was in Tokyo, it was in my kitchen, which is probably not the healthiest thing to do. And then when I moved to Sydney, I had a second bathroom, which I'd converted to darkroom. And then when I moved to Perth, I also luckily had like a laundry bathroom area, which I set up as a darkroom. But that was 2005, and then I finished it because everything was already starting to turn digital, and I started shooting color negative, so I didn't need the darkroom. I had a scanner, and I could still get the film developed at a lab. I'd scan it, and I could send it off to the client or whatever, But when I went to China, I went twice in that 1 year, 2005. I was still shooting Hasselblad, and the second occasion I got this commission, which was a great story. It was about the Australian diaspora in China, young Australians moving to China because the Chinese economy was kind of opening up and booming, and they were looking for their fortune, if you like, So it was doing these portraits of different people.
Australians, like in China.
Yeah.
Or just any.
Well, there was two stories. So I can't remember which came first, but there's one on like young Chinese making it, like young 20-somethings. And then there was also another story about, actually, I correct myself, the Australian diaspora one was 2006 when I'd already moved. 2005 was, it was a story that the correspondent based in Shanghai, Colleen Ryan, was a great journalist, a good friend. She was doing this story on the Chinese bubble economy from the point of view of the young 20-somethings. So we organised different shoots with these different diverse young people, even like factory workers and what have you. So that was fantastic. Weirdly, another one of these scenarios is just like right time, right place. When I was going to Shanghai, I had a stopover in Hong Kong because I'd always kind of stop in Hong Kong because I used to had some friends there, pick up cheap film, and then you take it to China. I was in the Foreign Correspondents Club meeting a guy who I knew, who's more of a writer. His partner had just become editor-in-chief of Vogue China, which had just started. And I'm in there, have Mark Graham, I'm having a beer with him, and he just mentions, I had my portfolio, I was showing him some stuff, I can't remember why. But he said, his partner was Angelica Chang, was just having a meeting with someone, another photographer. She came over to our table, joined us for a drink, and she was looking through my portfolio and said, "Oh, look, do you want to? Can you do some work for us this week if you're going to Shanghai?" So I had 2 weeks of work with them, Vogue China, plus doing this one for Australian Financial Review, plus I was doing my own stuff. So I was there for I think about 3 weeks, but it was just like...
Good. That was a good...
well, yeah, it was just like, what? Absolutely, yeah.
I guess that's like a good
synchronicity.
tip for, always have your portfolio on you.
Well, in those days you had to have like a hard copy, but now it's just you have a website. And
or like Instagram.
Yeah.
But I think maybe it's still good to have a hard copy.
It's impressive, even if you have like just a little booklet, small, something you print out before you leave. And if they're cheap enough, you can leave some behind. That's like, because no one does that anymore, What used to happen when I was starting out was like you'd make a postcard and you'd have a photo on it of yours, and you'd literally send it off and mail it to, a magazine photo editor or what have you. So now it's just, as you're saying, Instagram, but so that's what happened on that occasion, and that led me to, because I hadn't been getting that great work in Perth, I was just scraping by, and after what happened on the second occasion, I went to Shanghai. I thought, fuck it, I think I want to leave Perth. And the mother of my kids, she was also wanting to go back to North America, so she decided to do that, and I decided to take my 4-year-old son, because that was the agreement. Like, she takes our daughter, who was 9 at the time, and I take my son, and we went to Shanghai. So that was a crazy, this was 2006. So I'm there with my son, and I have to, make it work for him as well as me. It was a very intense time, but and I even got I got my son into Mandarin kindergarten.
Does he speak Mandarin?
He could understand some by the time he'd finished, but he wouldn't speak. It was more of out of defiance than anything at the time. But it was pretty hard on him, obviously. And I had some good people I knew at that time who helped look after me and my son, and because we were like an oddment, really. I was like early 40s and photographer, and I got a 4-year-old son. Like, what's going on here, But we had some fun times. We had a bike, and he'd sit on the back of the bike, and we'd cycle around everywhere, ice creams and stuff. But it was too difficult after 4 months, so I moved him back to California, where his mother was. And so the next, so I don't want to waffle, but it was the next 6 years I'd be going to and fro to California to visit my kids, or I'd bring them over to Shanghai in the summer, which was a fantastic experience, a real immersion.
Do your kids have a connection to Shanghai?
Well, they do, actually. My daughter, who's now 27, she did when she was studying, was at university in the US, she did a study abroad semester in Shanghai at Fudan University, and she learnt Mandarin. And she always found China fascinating, but she hasn't gone back. She's now in New York, but just because of the political situation with Xi Jinping, and it's all a bit difficult. But ironically, my son, he hasn't been back because it was 2012 was the last time, but he subsequently went to Japan. I think partly kind of romantically, because he knew that's where his mother and I met, and he went back to Japan and did a study abroad there and learnt the language and can write as well. And he's heading back there in a couple of months. But I've stepped way ahead. But So what happened is in Japan, China, ended up being there for 6 years, and I worked with international magazines mostly, and again doing portraits and sometimes feature work, and then I got some corporate work, which obviously pays better, and you have to photograph some CEOs or factories or whatever.
What did you like about working and living in China, and what were the pros and cons of working and living in China at that time?
It was I found it was a lot more immersive, and I liked the Chinese people, and obviously not many spoke English, but they were more kind of rough around the edges, a bit like Australians, whereas, for instance, by comparison to Japan, it was all very buttoned down. And I can't say a bad word about the Japanese because I love them too, and I love my experience there, but it was just psychologically I found it even though I could speak some of the language, it was more intense, because you couldn't just kind of, the Chinese, for instance, they get rowdy with you sometimes, or they get annoyed, or but they could have a laugh too. It was just more open, and the Chinese society I found more fascinating in a way, because it means a remarkable history as well. I know Japan has as well, but it was just they were more expressive, I suppose, the Chinese. And I enjoyed that. Even if there's obviously language barriers, it was still, you could relate, and they had more of a sense of humour. It was like, in a way, more expressive sense of humour.
And what were sort of the most interesting projects that you did in China, like the key projects that you focused on? Because you did mention some before, but I think you mentioned like the kids who.
Oh yeah. So when I first, this is when I hadn't moved there. I was just on my first and second visit. I started photographing, kind of street photography, doing portraits of, in particular, what I referred to as kind of the graduates of the one-child policy. So these were Chinese in they'd be in their early 20s, because the one-child policy, I think, started in 79 from memory. So, prior to that, it didn't really exist. And even so, like some of the rural areas, because particularly with farm environments, they were allowed to have more children just to help with the farming. But the cities was all one child. And so I was kind of fascinated by that aspect. And so I would, procure someone's help. I'd pay like a student or something to follow me around one day, and I'd try and get interact with young people and get their portraits and find out a bit about their story and what have you. So, but nothing really big. I did that project, but I didn't feel like it was finished, and nothing ever became of it. I tried to sell to some publications when I was back in Australia, but from memory, didn't really work. And a lot of my work was like that. It's probably similar to other kind of photojournalistic photographers too, because you can have a story that's published and you get paid well for it, but the magazine might only use 6 images. But meanwhile you've got all these rolls of film, or in digital, like hundreds, thousands of images which are never seen, that see the daylight, or projects which you try and work on yourself, but they don't come to fruition somehow, or you miss the moment. And so there was quite a bit of that. But yeah, I mean, as I was explaining to you just earlier, that I just started scanning on the weekend some of that work from 2005, street photos, and I was thinking, well, shit, I never scanned that before, and this is a pretty cool shot, Well, the person's got an interesting expression. So I have been going through my archives, particularly since I bought a new scanner during COVID, because I was losing a lot of work, and I just figured, here's an opportunity, finally. So over the last 4 years, I've been, scanning quite a bit of my old black and white work from the 90s, from the 2000s, colour and egg.
If you were, what sort of advice would you give to a young documentary photographer sort of to choose projects to work on? Like, would you say look at what's happening in the news at the moment, or what's kind of happening at the times now, or would you say pick something personal to you?
I'd say maybe a combination of both, really. And the more you do it, the more you develop your own style in a way, like your own approach. Like behind the scenes, or like how do you put someone at ease? How do you gain their trust? As well as compositionally, how you go about framing, whether it's a portrait or whether it's a like a reportage kind of action shot. So I'd definitely say the ones that work best are the ones where you feel invested in, and you feel like my one that never amounted to anything. There were lots of those, with the one-child policy. But
so you were just interested in it, and that's why you did it.
Yeah, I was curious.
It wasn't like trending or anything, or
sorry,
it wasn't like in the news or anything at the time.
Not really. No. And
you were just like, oh, that's interesting. I'm gonna.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other thing about being a photographer, and particularly, whatever you want to label yourself as, reportage or photojournalist or editorial photographer, it's like you have to have a curiosity. It's not like a studio photographer who's perhaps involved in photography, different motivation. Like if you're photographing on the street and doing what we're, photo stories, you have to be curious about life and curious about people. And if you're not, then you're probably not going to gravitate toward, magazine or photography, editorial photography, photo reportage. So that's what always got me. It was just because, I was traveling as a backpacker before I even got interested in photography, and because I was curious about the world, And then you got a camera, and that kind of gives you entree. Remarkable. Just by, if you have a camera, people think you're serious, or it just gives you an opening, like Narnia, open a door into something else. So you kind of bridge those differences, whether it's language or cultural or both. So just, so to answer your question, I think you've got to have a curiosity, you've got to be something interesting in yourself, but yes, to be smart, if you know that, you're aware of the whatever's transpiring in the world at the moment in terms of news or issues, if you come across something like that, wherever you might be, in Australia or overseas, the smart thing to do is, if you're curious about it, pick up on it and try and follow.
And is there much like work in the documentary photography world at the moment, in terms of because print was much bigger before the internet, and it's now it's all sort of social media or blogs and that sort of thing is where documentary photography is needed.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a very, very good question, because the print advertising or magazine publishing or newspaper publishing too, it all survived on advertising, so that the more advertising, the bigger the magazines seem to get, and the bigger budgets they could afford to dish out for, freelancers to be commissioned or what have you, the journalists and photographers. But so all the advertising shifted in the last space of 20 years. It's shifted more and more into online, So as you say, you've got a lot of what were magazines or newspapers are mostly actually online now. And if they still have a hard copy print run, it's quite small, but it's like you buy a subscription to the New York Times or the Guardian or Wall Street Journal. It's people you'll usually access it via their mobile phone or laptop. So I'm still in the game, but my opportunities for that have just diminished, and even online. Even not online, but in-flight magazines, which were like, as I was saying, they were kind of a sideline, which would be quite great if you're particularly doing foreign travel stuff. You could do a couple of soft stories for them, then you can do your more interesting stuff for yourself or for other publications. But in-flight magazines barely exist anymore. They're like kind of in-flight duty-free magazine now. It's like nothing. So yeah, and it's affecting photographers of my generation and obviously younger ones. But I guess you have to. I accept it's kind of gone. I still work with magazines who still graciously call me for a gig. You know.
Is that like mostly local stuff, or you?
I don't do anything locally,
or?
really. It's like I get an occasional call from overseas. Well, not call, I mean, I get an email.
And then you go overseas typically, or you?
No, it's only if, because that's all changed too. Like, once upon a time, they'd fly us somewhere. Anywhere in the world now, there's a network of photographers, and the budgets are tight, so they usually, unless you're James Natchway or someone, a famous, you get flown anywhere. But no. It's local, so I'll get an email, for instance, for they need a portrait or some story covered here. But that's getting pretty, rare.
So what stuff do you focus on mostly? Like what are you most busy
My work
with?
now.
Yeah.
Well, the archive has kind of spun off a side income, I guess, because some of this work which was just sitting there. I've approached some of the state library, the National Library, and I'm trying to approach some other museums and what have you to see if they're interested in some of my archive material.
Like buying the work?
Yeah. So I still have copyright, but they have a copy in their archives.
Okay.
So I did a bit of that. I started doing just recently oral history recordings. So you might think that's unrelated entirely to photography, but it's actually not, because it's still storytelling. So oral histories are essentially like you sit down with someone of interest that might, depending on their background, you get their life story. Well, I'm doing this current project with the National Library on particularly pertaining to the COVID pandemic in Australia and how it affected Australian society and how people dealt.
Okay,
So
it's still like storytelling and documentary.
Absolutely, it's storytelling. So you have to research, and then you have to map out questions particular to this, the particular person's job or what their involvement was in the COVID, and then I do a portrait at the end. So it's quite neat. It's exactly what you said. It's a storytelling. So I enjoy doing that. I still do some work with the newspapers, which I never used to work with newspapers before. It was always, magazine stuff. But I do newspaper work, some press stuff. Sometimes.
Like local news stories you'd go out
not again from Perth. It's usually from Sydney, like Murdoch.
But they would want you to shoot something in...
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So they call me...
So like you're their contact. Yeah.
Yep, I'm one of a few contacts they have in Perth, so I do that. And the archive stuff, I'm actually kind of rethinking about it, and because a lot of the work I would do, I'd always be busy, even if I wasn't working on a commission gig. I used to like doing my own work, and that could be kind of collage, or it could be a personal story about my family and what have you. So I've always been involved in that. It's kind of as an art form. So the archive work has enabled me to kind of revisit my old work and trying to make different stories out of that. Not for commercial purposes, but just for myself.
Yep. Okay. And yeah, I was going to ask, how have you seen photography change? Because it was film and digital, now we're going to like AI photography. What has changed and what hasn't changed? Because maybe that can kind of help people focus on what.
Another good question. I think once again it comes back to the motivation of like why you want to. If someone were interested to become a photographer, why would you want to do it? There's got to be a passion, and there's got to be some sort of a motivation. As mine was. Okay, I had a background as studied architecture, but it was more that what grew out of that was the fascination through my travels for connecting and being fascinated and curious about other people. So I wanted to photograph them and trying to capture some of that their personality and their culture or whatever it might be, you know. So yeah, there was a mystery, and it's still kind of a mystique about darkroom and printing and, you know, developing a film and then seeing the print image come up in the developer tray, which is still remarkable. I haven't done it for a while, but it was just like a, you know, Pandora's box opening up there. It was a mystique about the darkroom. So, okay, you know, like I said, almost 20 years ago, I closed my darkroom down, but you still get enjoyment from the photography by it's that connection to whatever you're photographing. It doesn't matter if you're a nature photographer or, you know, you like my motivation was to connect to people. The camera still is that magic conduit, if you like, between you as an artist, the photographer, to whatever your subject is. So that hasn't changed between being, you know, analog film or digital. I do have reservations about the digital because it works in a different way. If you grew up and was shooting film, there's that tactile thing, you know, like it's a physical element, and then you know, develop it, whether it's at a lab or in your darkroom, and you got the negative strips and you get a context sheet, you know, it's palpable, there's something there. Whereas the other thing, which is more critical, I think, is you slow down, because, you know, with the old analog camera, you crank shaft, click, move the next frame ahead, click. So even if you did it quickly, it wasn't like, it was like,
yeah.
Whereas the digital, a lot of guys, a lot of photographers just
shoot on burst.
yeah, and it's just yeah, and to an extent, as long as you got it framed, focused, any idiot can get the moment, because you could just shoot, you know, 100 frames within the space of a couple of minutes. But there's something about the magic of being in the moment, going back to Cartier-Bresson, and you've got the film analog camera and you're slowing down and you're actually you're more aware of what's happening within the frame, you know, the movement of someone coming in from the side. Whereas with the digital, you're maybe not as conscious of all of that. You're focusing on the main subject, whoever it might be, but you're not as aware of all the little intricacies and nuances that are happening within the frame, because you're just thinking about, I'll get the moment because I can shoot another one, you know, within a split second, because it's digital.
So the process of
there's a psychological aspect of it's made it different, you know. But
what stayed the same was the relationship with the subject and
the motivation, yes, and you as the artist or the photographer trying to connect with the world in however you want. That hasn't changed, but it's just like the actual, I think the medium itself has brought about maybe, as I was saying, that nuance of being in the moment, whereas digital, not so much. And then you move on to the AI. It's like, man, it's like a big, you know, a couple of big question marks. It's like, and the thing that should be considered also with this is the actual ownership of copyright, because, you know, once upon a time, particularly if you had the film, when you analog society, you know, that was your image, and it would be controlled in that it was controlled by you and which publication it went into, you know. And then you got photo libraries that kind of, you know, stock libraries, whatever, they would have control. But now, with everything being online, it doesn't matter if it's a digital or analog film image, it's like, well, who owns it, you know? And there's no way you can probably retrieve, you know, if you're due a royalty, because an image like some of my, you know, the Tarantino one again, you mentioned it was Jeff Buckley is just used everywhere.
All over Tumblr or something like Tumblr.
Well, no, it's just like, you know, you'll find it enough, and particularly Instagram, they use the Jeff Buckley one's used over and over again. I don't mind it. I had issue with it originally, but like, you know, you can't beat it. So sometimes people would be kind enough to ask, like, you know, I'm going to, you know, use your image for my Instagram feed. Is that okay? And I'd say, look, yeah, but can you just, you know, link it back to me, or just, you know, have my tag? That's all I can ask, you know.
Yeah.
So I'd imagine, you know, people who are a lot more into, you know, popular images or celebrity and that. I mean, their images, just being used everywhere, and they're never going to get that. Like the copyright's kind of what is it, you know? Because okay, you can control it being printed or used when people contact you directly, but once it's on the internet, it's like it's out there, and I think that's a bigger issue in terms of photography, kind of controlling your ownership of an image. And then AI is just, well, I don't know. I mean, it would have to be heavily legislated, and I think they're trying to still kind of work around, you know, the government and well, not just Australian, but internationally, kind of control its use so as it's regulated in some way. But again, it's just like the
It's the Wild West.
the clown's out of the box or whatever, you know. It's just
yeah, we don't really know what's happening with it at the moment. Just it's like it's so new that there's nothing stopping it at the moment.
Exactly. Yeah.
And recently you released the Freddie Incident, which was a short documentary about
on Max Pam. Yeah. So that's the last 10 years, I suppose. Again, it goes back to just me wanting to be a storyteller, and I'd always actually kind of been interested in filmmaking, even maybe before I became a photographer, but I never knew how to join the dots. And after studying architecture, I sure as hell didn't want to go back to do a formal course, you know. So I kind of, when I was in, another reason for me going and being in Shanghai was there appeared to be so many opportunities. So I figured I could maybe segue into film. This is like, you know, back in 2006.
Using like a
or just, you know,
like a VHS or those high 8 cameras, like
I had one of those little guys, yeah, and even with the DSLR video, you know, so I kind of forced. Yes, but I didn't. Okay, that segue didn't really happen because I still found earning money from as a stills photographer was far more accessible than if you're trying to do film. So I kind of forced myself to make a couple of short films, not documentary, just kind of fictional narratives. And the first one was a total mess. It was Stiletto, it was called. It was kind of like a psychological thriller. But the second one was more kind of lyrical, and I enjoyed. I was obviously not marketing it well enough. I didn't get into any festivals, but I still have it on my website. It's called Pop. It was the story of this erstwhile lovers, foreigners living in Shanghai, and they reconnect after he finds out he's terminally ill. But it was kind of based around the.
It's a documentary film?
No, it was a narrative. It was Kubler-Ross. It was kind of based around Kubler-Ross's. I think it was 5 stages of acceptance of death. You know, and it was kind of heavy, but it was. I enjoyed the film. I still like watching it once in a while. But from that point, I started making more and more shorts, and usually more documentaries. And I did make some more fictional ones in Perth. But I found, to be honest, it was kind of you're doing something on the smell of an oily rag, and trying to get good actors was always difficult because there's no point doing a film if you got actors who are kind of
average.
Yeah, and not really understanding the character. So I kind of decided, okay, I'll focus on documentary because it's kind of where I'm from anyway. So, alas, cut to the chase. Max Pam, who's a local photographer and highly regarded internationally, and beautiful work, and he was another influence on my work, certainly. From the late 90s when I got to know his work better, because it's kind of more of a looser style and it wasn't as anal. He could capture something like the poetry and the mystique of a place, even if it wasn't focused, you know. It was just the way he did it. And again, he always, in the early days, he used mostly square format, so I could kind of relate to that. And so I caught up with Max, who I've known for a long time, and had introduced this idea of making a film on his, kind of based around his travel journals, because it's intricate, beautiful travel journals.
Had he ever done anything like that with him actually telling the story with his voice recorded? Or?
No, surprisingly. He'd never had a film made about his work and that, but it was intended to be a feature, but I'd been working on it for 3.5 years by the time I finished the short. And the feature story, it was nothing to do with Max. It was probably more me, my limited abilities, and I was trying to get a really, number one, a strong story that would lead through 80 minutes or, what have you, and keep your attention, because the story's number one. Everything else is secondary. And I was getting help from a friend of mine, Hussein, who's living overseas, but good documentary film brain. And we just couldn't see that a long feature story narrative was going to work. And I didn't want to just abandon the story, because I'd actually got some funding from Screen West, luckily. And so I came up with this kind of a out-of-the-box style of using Max, a great little story from Max's memoir, who he just had published last year. And I'd been working on draft, he'd given me a draft of it, so I'd already had the story in my mind from 3 years prior. And we decided to, my decision was, okay, he doesn't have photos of the actual story, because he was just starting out in his career at that time. But he had plenty of stories, plenty of images based around, South Asia, India. The story is set in Kabul, in Afghanistan, and he had some images from that in Pakistan. So I could figure I could try and use semiotics to tell the story with his voiceover, and I'd write like a brief text, edited, which he could tell as in conversation, and I'd use his images so people could get a distinct idea of his work and his style. So that's what I decided to do with the short film. So I had this great little story from his memoir, and I used his voiceover. We went to a studio and he recorded it as though he was kind of in conversation with me. And then I used just his images to use as illustration, if you like. So it's kind of like two layers. You got his narrative and voiceover plus these images. And so I think it worked well. So, and
just maybe you could give the audience a brief summary of what sort of happened
Okay, so it was like a seminal moment in Max's career whereby, so he just decided to be a photographer. It was 1970. He'd studied for a short while in London. He'd flown over there from Melbourne, where he was brought up. And he did this amazing overland journey in the days when you could actually do the full overland, before Iran got into complications with Iraq and before Russia invaded Afghanistan. So in the 70s, there was this window, in the late 60s too, where you could actually take a bus and go from London to Calcutta. And so he's on this great journey. In a nutshell, he has this incident occur in his hotel in Kabul where one of his fellow travellers dies, and then he's kind of extorted by the backpacker bus travellers, including Max, are held to ransom, if you like, in a way, by the local police. And then they have to pay off the police in order to get out. And from there, he has this bizarre journey at the border post with Pakistan. This song from the South Pacific musical is playing, which happened to be his mother's favourite song. So all the shit he's been through and having to deal with is trying to, pay off the police and being accused of being a murderer and what have you. He gets this emotional change at the border where he's hearing this bizarre in Pakistan border post. This South Sea island with what's the song again? I can hear the tune, I can't hear the words. But anyway, it's from the South Pacific, Rodgers and Hammerstein. And as that's occurring, hearing the music, he just his sorrow and the wanting to be with his mum, who's back in Melbourne, it just engulfs him, the emotion, and he just
feels like a surreal, emotional.
Absolutely, yeah. From the fact you're in the border post with Pakistan and Afghanistan, you're hearing this, this music from a bygone. He can remember his mum playing it in the kitchen back home in Melbourne.
Also, he had like a whole sort of flashback moment.
Yeah,
And that
just
sort of affected him. He remembered that throughout his whole life. That sort of moment, was that an important?
Well, yeah, well, just on the back end of having to deal with the situation of being accused of murder by these unscrupulous.
And so it was like a very intense, emotional time.
Yeah, for him, undoubtedly, and that I mean that could have spelt the end of his photography career before it even began. You know, if he had to spend his rest of his days in prison in Kabul. At the same time, it kind of launched his career and his fascination for Southern Asia, where he used to go back time and time again particularly to India. And you know, over the course of the next 20 years, he had this remarkable body of work, which would be his entree into like international kind of stardom as a photographer. So it went this critical seminal moment in his life.
Awesome. And so I guess in summary, although photography's changed, the demand for photography's changed and the types of photography, you're still finding the elements of documentary in different things that you do, whether it's video or audio.
Absolutely, yeah. And without labouring the point, it's like my whole idea of going to the film was I was hoping to segue, because obviously, as we've discussed, photography as an entity for storytelling is commercially quite limited now as it is. Whether it'll ever swing back the other way, I don't know. But I just figured there might be more opportunity with video to tell stories and have it commercially possible, So you could team up with a production company, or you could get a distributor and you get funding, and then you can make a living out of it. So that was my intention, and certainly even with the Max Pam film, it's by no means finished. I mean, I got this beautiful little vignette as a short film, but I wanted to try and make it into like a half hour and then make a series. So I think you've got to find a niche.
And you haven't tried TikTok?
Haven't tried
Making
TikTok.
stories on TikTok.
I haven't, no.
That's
I don't
that can be
know.
next.
Yeah. I'd have to be better at marketing. I've got to improve that. But I kind of do my own thing, and if other people notice it, that's great. But I'm not big on self-promotion, so that's one thing I've got to improve on.
That's probably all we got time for, but thanks so much, Philip, for coming on and telling your story.
Harry, pleasure. Thanks so much, mate. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you for sharing. I mean, not just mine, but all your stories. It's fabulous. And
where can people find you online?
Well, they can spell my name. They can see my website.
PhilipGostelow.com.
Yeah, Philip with one L, Gostelow, Gostelow.
And I'll link it down below.
Yeah, and I'm on Instagram. I don't do a heck of a lot of Instagram, but I'm trying to keep in there.
I'll get you onto the Instagram reels.
Yeah, do it, mate.